Okay, today's lesson is how do we take the converse of a conditional statement. So let's first define the converse of a conditional statement. Everyone should be writing this down in their notes. This belongs in your notes. If you need to, put your player on pause and then hit resume when you are ready. So the converse of a conditional statement switches the premise and conclusion. So what used to be the premise is now the conclusion, and what used to be the conclusion is now the premise. Let's take an example, and these examples belong in your notes. So if today is Monday, then I eat PB&J for lunch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch the premise and conclusion, and the converse is if I eat PB&J for lunch, then today is Monday. Notice how all I did was I took what was the conclusion and that became my premise, and I took what was my premise and that became my conclusion. Let's take another example. Take these examples down, they're important. If a quadrilateral is a square, then the figure has 4 right angles. We're going to take the converse of that by switching the premise and conclusion. So if the figure has 4 right angles, then the quadrilateral is a square. Let's take a third example. If you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. So switching the premise and conclusion, the converse will look like this. If you live in Illinois, then you live in Chicago. So the question is the converse of a conditional statement always true? Let's take a look. So the first one was, if I eat PB&J for lunch, then today is Monday. Is that necessarily true? In other words, if today is Monday, then I eat PB&J for lunch. Every Monday I eat peanut butter and jelly. But if I eat peanut butter and jelly for lunch, does that mean today is Monday? No, it does not, because I can be eating PB&J every day of the week. In other words, you need a counterexample to show that the converse is false. And here is the counterexample. Let's take the next one that we discussed. The second example was this. The converse was, if the figure has 4 right angles, then the quadrilateral is a square. Is that necessarily true? In other words, can you come up with a counterexample? Yes, you can. Here is your counterexample. Here is something that has 4 right angles, but it is not a square. It is a rectangle. Let's take a third example. And the third example was Chicago. So the statement was, if you live in Chicago, then you live in Illinois. And the converse was, if you live in Illinois, then you live in Chicago. Is the converse true? In other words, if you live in Illinois, does that mean the only city you can be living in is Chicago? No, of course it's not true, because you can be living in any one of these lovely cities. You can be living in, let's see, you can be living in Rockford, you can be living in Elgin or Naperville or Joliet, you can be living in Peoria or Springfield or Davenport. So no, the converse is not true, and the counterexample is any one of those cities. You don't need to list all the cities in Illinois to show that the converse is false. So here's what I'd like you to do. Write the converse of the following conditional statement and decide whether your answer is whether the converse is true or false. Put your player on pause, write the conditional down, write the converse down, and determine the truth value of the converse. And when you're done, hit resume. Okay, so if 2 lines intersect to form right angles, then they are perpendicular. So what is the converse? If 2 lines are perpendicular, then they intersect to form right angles. Is the converse true? Well, if 2 lines are perpendicular to each other, then yes, they do form 90-degree angles. So the definition of perpendicular lines is 2 lines that form right angles. So absolutely the converse is true. This should be down in your notes, especially this part right over here. Okay, let's take a look at writing the conditional from a Venn diagram. So take down this Venn diagram, Romance languages, and then in Romance languages you have Italian. So the directions are write the conditional based on the Venn diagram, then write the converse of the conditional, and then determine the truth value of both the conditional and the converse. And if either is false, you have to give a counterexample. Put your player on pause. I want you to do this right now, and then when you're done, hit resume. Okay, so what is the conditional for this Venn diagram? Well, very simply, if the language is Italian, then it's a Romance language. What is the converse of that statement? If the language is a Romance language, then it's Italian. So what about the conditional? What is the truth value there? Well, I know that Italian is a Romance language. So if the language is Italian, then it is definitely a Romance language. So the truth value of the conditional statement, the original conditional statement, that is true. Then the question is, if the language is a Romance language, does it have to necessarily be Italian? In other words, is Italian the only Romance language? And the answer is no, it is not the only Italian. It is not the only Romance language. French is a Romance. Catalan and Spanish, they are also Romance languages. And so the conditional is true, but the converse is false. All you need is one counterexample for the converse. Here's what I'd like you to do. Put your player on pause. What you're going to do is you're going to state the converse of each conditional statement. Okay, so write the conditional statement down, write its converse, and determine whether or not the converse is true. If the converse is not true, come up with a counterexample. Put your player on pause, do each one of these. I will scroll down. And when you're done, hit resume. All this belongs in your notes, and I will look at your notes the next time I see you. Okay, so the first one, if a figure is a square, then it has 4 sides. The converse is going to be, if a figure has 4 sides, then it's a square. And the answer is false, because it can be a rectangle. The next one, if all 3 sides of a triangle are equal, then the triangle is a quadrilateral. Let's take the converse. If the triangle is a quadrilateral, then all 3 sides are equal. And that is true because the definition of an equilateral triangle is a triangle where all 3 sides are congruent. Let's take a look at the next one. If it has been raining, then the sidewalks are wet. So the converse you should have come up with is, if the sidewalks are wet, then it has been raining. And of course that is false, because it can be, the sidewalks can be wet for any number of reasons. I might have dropped a vase full of flowers and water, and that's why the sidewalk is wet. Or you could have turned on a hose. Next one, if a number is divisible by 2, then the number is even. So your converse should be, if the number is even, or sorry, if the number is divisible by 2, then the number is even. No, that is not the converse. The converse is, let's actually fix that right now. So the converse is, let's fix that right now on the fly. So if the number is even, then the number is divisible by 2. That is the converse. If the number is even, then the number is divisible by 2. That is true because that is the definition of an even number, a number that is divisible by 2. That is the definition. So that is true. The converse is true. Okay, and the next one is, if a stranger walks by the house, then the dog will bark. And the converse of that statement is, if the dog will bark, or the dog barks, then a stranger walked by the house. Is that necessarily true? No, because the dog can bark for any number of reasons, and here are just 2 as examples. So I hope that helps. Look on Jupiter Grades, take a look at your homework, and we'll see you in class.